Okay, this is my pedigree for my mother's, well, it's my mother's pedigree, and she's Val Angus and Nee Muller, and then we've got Peter Hendrik Muller, Cornelius Johannes Andres Muller, and another Peter Hendrik Jacobus Muller, and then we've got another Cornelius Johannes Andres Muller. And the Muller line goes back a long way to Germany. That's been fairly well traced through back to Germany. And then we've got up here, right up here, Cornelius Johannes Andres Muller. We've got him marrying Sarah Elizabeth Jackson. And that was a real surprise to find a Jackson in an Afrikaner family. My mother's largely of an Afrikaner background, and to find a name like Jackson was unusual, so we thought, well, it's got to be Scottish, Irish or English. Turns out that it's a Scottish Jackson. And perhaps there are other Jacksons. I thought perhaps there were Jacksons, what was an anglicised version from Europe, but it turned out to be a Scottish Jackson. And it was by James Jackson, who was one of the early British, well, it was actually a Scotsman called Moody, surname Moody, that went to South Africa and tried to establish a colony there. It was a bit unsuccessful, to be honest, but he integrated in with Afrikaner families, and soon their name almost disappeared, except, of course, there are Jackson descendants. But it's unusual because they're really Afrikaner Jacksons now. Okay, so then we've got here in my mother's paternal grandfather, his mother, sorry, was Nordea. We've got other names like my mother's paternal grandmother was a Boshoff, and we know the Boshoff line way back to a very early Boshoff who came from, we believe now, he was probably Dutch, but he may have spent time in Bayonne, famous for bayonets, and it sounds like he was actually an arms manufacturer, very early, making muskets and things, in South Africa. And we've got on my mother's maternal side, her mother was a Duro, and we have the Duros going back quite a long way to Carl David Duro. Now, this side particularly was the side that came over in various British settlements of what were Prussian peoples, and the idea was to bring families that had marriageable daughters, especially, they were to encourage them to come and settle in South Africa, and the idea being so that they could perhaps be married off to the German people that the British had actually already brought over there to act as troops, and pretty much frontline frontier type troops. So the idea was that they would have some brides from all these marriageable daughters. So we've got names like Duro, and then we've got, well, the Duro here, Martin Friedrich, oops, I've jumped a step, sorry. We've got Carl David Duro married Wilhelmina Louise Retschlag, and we've got, over here we've got a Botcher, and they came over, Martin Friedrich Botcher and his wife Auguste Caroline Wilhelmina Botcher came over, and she was a Vornecker, I think that's maybe how you pronounce it, and they came over from these sorts of regions of what was sort of formerly Prussia, around that region. And then we have the Muskies, and then we have Gottfried Muskie was married to Anna Christine Tom. And then we have Friedrich Wilhelm Kroll, and I've just forgotten now whom he was married to. But again, We have lines that do go quite a long way back. We're a little bit mystified about the Nordea line. We can't quite pin them down to a specific Sarl or Nordea or Nordea. Okay, so I'll bring my mother into the shot and we'll have a look at her ethnic origins, which will reach back further than these lines. They do go back, some of them go back a very long way. We've managed to trace them, some of them particularly far. You can see 30 generations further back. And when I say trace them, that's as far as the general records go. Each line, of course, would have to be proved with solid paper trails, but that's some of the general accepted lines. And some of it is very well documented. So I'll bring my mother into the shot and she can have a look at her FamilyTreeDNA Ethnic Origins. So if you come in, whoops. And if you just
yes, you can see better. Yeah.
seated there, yeah, it's much better.
Mm.
Okay. I'll just let the cat out quickly. Go in.
Otherwise she'll sit there and meow. Cornelius Johannes Andres Muller.
That's it. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll just flick over to Mum's ethnic origins. I've logged in already under her login. So we'll have a look and see at her origins. And this is going to be a real surprise.
Yeah, my goodness, look at that.
95% European, and this is the real surprise. 5% Middle Eastern.
Yeah.
Okay, let's have a look at the breakdown. There might be there might be a bit of a explanation for this. What I'll do is I'll try to. Whoops. There is a way of doing the two together, but just for now we'll concentrate on the European side. In many respects, somewhat similar to my father's line in the Scandinavian area. Quite a strong input from Scandinavia, and especially Norway. So Scandinavia usually extends sort of Denmark, Norway and Sweden and around there, but it's pretty strongly centred on Norway. So somewhere along the line you've had some Viking ancestors. It's quite likely that a little south of there, Vikings went down there. We know that they had settlements there in sort of northern coastal Poland there, what's now modern day Poland. But again, this was sort of Prussia, Prussia, Germany sort of area. So it's possible that that's where they came in. Instead of the British Isles, which you don't show any background, which is unusual because we have this Jackson input not that far back, which does make me wonder whether perhaps the Jacksons were from somewhere else. Perhaps they were from Europe, and I did mention the possibility that maybe those Jacksons were European Jacksons and then they anglicised, or in this case it became a Scottish version which was still pronounced probably Jackson, but maybe it was just son of Jack, so perhaps they could have also come from Europe a little bit further back. The ethnic origins tend to identify you with long-standing, older, reaching further back than your pedigrees will sort of immediately show. But that does open up a very interesting question mark. Why is there no Scottish Jacksons showing when they were relatively close by? So that's an interesting one. Certainly we understand the Polish-German connections. That Poland one that's in yellow used to be part of Prussia, and that's where the sort of Muskie, Kroll, Boccia and Giraud families seem to have come from that sort of region. We do know that in terms of the purple southern Europe connection, we know that there were Ferreiras. Mum is a descendant of one of the very early Ferreiras who was shipwrecked and who has a multitude of descendants in South Africa. And in fact, from my understanding, most of the Ferreiras, if not all of them, are descendant from that Ferreira. So that may explain quite well the Iberian. Oh, he was from Portugal, by the way, so that may well explain how we got the Southern Europe connection. But again, quite strong. It's 10%. Well, when I say strong, it's not just a trace. Now, of course, the big surprise is the Middle Eastern connection. However, it is Turkey, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and that sort of region, just squeaking over the border a little bit into Syria, and perhaps even a little touch in Iran. So we don't know from where, but it's not impossible that you have some ancestor. And because it is 5%, it's perhaps just a small trace. Some ancestor or ancestors may have migrated. Perhaps they migrated either across the Bosphorus into northern Europe there, and then that's how they've ended up intermarrying with your Prussian and German ancestors, and some of the Dutch ones as well. So it's a bit of a mystery, and to have 5%, that's high enough to warrant. Now we'll just have a look and see what they call that. It's not just sort of Middle East, that's a little unusual. So if we click on that, we'll see that they call it Asia Minor. So it's very interesting, and that's a real mystery. We don't know where that has come in, and it is unusual. It's not showing up in the pedigree, but it obviously is there, and it'll be very interesting to if we can ever find quite where that connection is. I mean, Georgians are quite European looking, you know, Azerbaijan, but yeah, that was a surprise to me.
Even over to Syria.
Yeah, it's quite unusual. Well, it's unexpected, we'll put it that way. The interesting thing is this hasn't shown up in my DNA at all, and that's quite possible, where whole segments from former ancestors might be cut out in the process of the merging of DNA from parents, but it doesn't show in mine at all. But I thought that would be a bit of a surprise. Are you surprised to see that?
Yeah, I am.
Yeah, it does.
Turkey, Georgia, Azerbaijan,
Syria. Yeah, it's a most unusual thing. So I think we're all a little bit surprised about Dad's Southern Europe connection. Your Southern Europe connection isn't even as strong as Dad's, so that was a bit of a surprise. The other surprise was to see that the Scandinavian sort of input from both Mum and Dad were basically Viking, definitely from Norway Scandinavians, which were largely Vikings. I do understand it with Mum, and I suspect with Dad there's quite a story behind that. We haven't got that far back, but perhaps something will turn up with some of the maternal lines that we can't quite yet trace. But that's pretty much it, and I hope you've enjoyed the tour of your more ancient origins.
I had a lovely time.
Good one.
Quite interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Very interesting.
Okay, I'm just having a look at my mother's FamilyTreeDNA Ethnic Origins map, and I'll just expand this a little. Let's just do it that way, and then we can see these different color codings a little bit closer.
it's quite interesting to sort of have a look at this area, in particular this area of Turkey, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. If we have a look at the ancient origins, we see some migration routes by which earlier ancestors may have come into Europe. And as you can see, coming up through this region here into Europe. And we've got hunter-gatherers. My mother has actually sort of identified with about 41% in that group. It's just making a point here that although this is autosomal DNA, and autosomal DNA is supposed to only reach back, I think it's about sort of between 7 and 10 generations or so, depending on how many cases of intermarriage between near or distant cousins there were. Might get a bit of strengthening, which allows you to reach back a little further. So somewhere between sort of 7 and 10 generations, from my understanding. But despite this, autosomal DNA can actually reach back further in terms of origins, because what tends to happen is that peoples with common origins, the DNA just gets reinforced over and over again, and so there are some persistent segments of DNA which are used to identify ethnic origins. So there's a bit of a myth out there that autosomal DNA is not good for looking at origins, and you'd be better off looking at mitochondrial DNA, or you'd be better off at looking for Y-DNA, because it's very true that they do go back even hundreds of thousands of years. But autosomal DNA is certainly significant as well, because of this piling up of reinforcing of DNA that has come from people with similar ethnic origins. And there is some very serious research going on using autosomal DNA to pin people down, or people groups down to various regions, and it looks like that's quite a serious contender in the future for investigating ethnic origins. So anyway, I'll just continue. We've also got some other paths, if you have a look, more ancient paths by which peoples from Europe might have come up through this region, that's identifying with my mother. So it's almost like perhaps her later ancestors followed the path of former ancestors. The other possibility is that perhaps someone from this region perhaps was a trader, and much later ended up down in South Africa, and it's not impossible that Arab traders were trading around those regions. They may have stopped off at various African ports and perhaps traded and picked up slaves and went down to South Africa. So this is still a bit of a mystery as to how my mother has ended up with this quite strong signature down in this area. And it will create a source of great fascination, I think, for myself and for my mother and for our family. So there's another path here that you can see which really illustrates. Now, this is quite interesting because this is a much later path, going from sort of 3000 to 1000 BCE. So that's a very interesting possibility as well. So not only is there this route through the Bosphorus here, but basically there's this route through here, through the Caucasus, from whence the Caucasians arise. So that's another possibility as well. So anyway, that's a very interesting source of possible origins for my mother's DNA that's showing a signature from this area. Now, just popping back to her, I'm just going to have a little brief view of now my two parents and my own DNA ethnic origins. So you can see this is my mother, as I've discussed here. And if we have a look here, you'll notice that these colours are a little sort of slightly pale compared to, for instance, my father's. But you'll see the signatures are the same in up here in Norway, or in the Norwegian sort of area. Down here in the southern Europe area, they're sort of pretty much the same. And there's a difference between my father and mother's DNA, particularly, or their ethnic origins, in terms of my father's more strong on the British Isles. My mother's quite strong on the area here in Switzerland, Paris, France. Paris is, of course, the capital, but France, and running into Germany. It makes a lot of sense with what we know about her ethnic origins, or certainly about her pedigree and likely ethnic origins, just looking at the pedigree. And then, of course, there's this area over here, which is Eastern Europe, which is in hers and not in my father's. And we can actually see that happening. Oh, and just lastly, sorry, this area that we've just been chatting about. So if we can see those sort of disappear, if you like, and move accordingly, just between this is my mother again and this is my father. So again, this is my mother and this is my father. Now this is me. So you'll see that I have picked up my mother and my father's, both the Norwegian and the Southern Europe area. I've picked that up. I may have picked up a little bit of my mother's French connection over here, but it looks like I kind of lost the German connection here. And that's quite possible, the way that, because you inherit roughly 50% from each parent, it's quite possible that a whole segment of ethnic origin DNA, bearing DNA, is actually lost. So perhaps one of my siblings has picked this up. And you can see I've also lost this signature over here in my DNA as well. I don't have the signature from my mother in this area. So it's quite interesting. I'll just flick through the three again so you can get an idea. I've lined these up so that they just switch across sort of flawlessly. But I'll just go here. This is my signature, my father's, and my mother's. So my mother's, my father's, and my signature there. Okay, thanks again for spending the time. I hope that you are somewhat intrigued and interested in how ethnic origins tie in with pedigrees, and how perhaps they will just reach a little bit further back into your pedigrees, and yet there still is a seeming correlation between them. There might be the odd mystery, and certainly it's a very interesting field. As I say, hopefully as more research is done and more ancient DNA is dug up and analysed, and as larger groups of peoples with specific ethnic origins are identified, we'll get even a better idea. And this is very much at the beginning stage. We know that some of the research must be taken with a grain of salt, and some of it possibly with a granary of salt. But nevertheless, there is quite a promising field of research that looks like we will get a better and better idea as research is brought out. And there's some very exciting research that looks like we're going to be able to identify origins down to some fairly specific areas. And so I would encourage people to not just treat ethnic origins as some kind of a cocktail party piece, because I think in the future that really it will become sort of much more robust we're in the early days, and I just encourage you to get DNA tested. The more of us that do it, the more likely it is that we will get specific research that improves the information about ethnic origins. So thanks again for listening, and hopefully I'll make some more videos on some of the other aspects of both ancestry, DNA, and on family tree DNA, as you can see here. I'd also like to make some videos on GEDmatch and some of the other really good sites that are out there that can enhance your results and help you to track down relatives and ethnic origins. So thanks again for listening. Okay, bye.